The words hit the crystal chandelier like shattered glass, each syllable echoing through the embassy's grand dining hall until even the waitstaff paused mid-service. Meaningless, bureaucratic nonsense, my father declared, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. Playing diplomat while real people do real work. The laughter that followed wasn't kind. It rolled across the table where my engagement celebration was supposed to unfold, where my fiancé sat frozen with his wine glass halfway to his lips, where my career as a State Department negotiator was being dissected like a failed experiment. But Marcus, the man I'd met during the Syrian refugee crisis 3 years earlier, set down his glass with deliberate care, looked directly into my father's weathered face, and said with quiet conviction, "She's the reason 12 nations signed the Budapest Accords. The German chancellor specifically requested her by name for the climate negotiations." The silence that crashed over us wasn't polite dinner quiet. It was the kind of hush that follows lightning, when everyone holds their breath waiting for thunder that might never come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you want to understand how a daughter's diplomatic work became dismissed as meaningless paperwork and how foreign ministers eventually fought to have her at their negotiation tables, then let me take you back to where it all began. The scent of my father's aftershave still clings to memories of childhood mornings when I would watch him knot his tie in the hallway mirror, preparing for another day at the construction company he'd built from nothing. Viktor Petrov had arrived in Chicago with calloused hands and broken English, carrying dreams heavier than the duffel bag slung across his shoulder. By the time I was born, those same hands had signed contracts worth millions, and that broken English had transformed into the commanding voice that now dismissed my career as meaningless. Our house stood like a monument to his success, brick and marble testifying to every foundation he'd poured, every building that bore his signature. The dining room where we gathered each evening showcased awards from the Chamber of Commerce, photographs with mayors and governors, certificates that proved a man could remake himself through sheer determination. He'd built an empire from concrete and steel, and he expected his daughter to understand that real accomplishment meant something you could touch, measure, weigh in your hands. I was 7 when I first realized I'd disappointed him. The school had invited parents to career day, and while other fathers arrived in uniforms or business suits, mine came straight from a job site, boots still carrying traces of cement dust. He spoke about building the city's skyline, his accent thickening with pride as he described how structures rise from blueprints to reality. Afterward, when Mrs. Henderson asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, I stood small and uncertain and whispered, "I want to help people understand each other." The classroom erupted in that scattered applause children give when they're not sure what they've heard. But my father's face had already closed, his jaw setting into the expression I would come to know as disappointment dressed as patience. That night at dinner, he carved his steak with surgical precision and asked why I couldn't dream of building something permanent instead of chasing abstractions. "Words disappear, little one," he said in the measured tone he used for explaining complex things to simple minds. "Buildings remain. People need homes, not conversations." My mother, Elena, reached across the table to squeeze my hand, her touch warm with understanding my father couldn't offer. She taught high school literature and spoke 4 languages, though she rarely used more than English in his presence. Later, when he'd retreated to his study to review blueprints, she would tell me stories of diplomats and translators who had prevented wars with nothing more than carefully chosen words. The divide widened as I grew older. While he attended groundbreaking ceremonies and ribbon cuttings, I devoured books about international relations and studied maps of countries where conflicts simmered just beneath the surface of headlines. At 15, I spent summers volunteering with refugee resettlement organizations, helping families navigate the labyrinth of paperwork that stood between them and new lives. The work fascinated me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The delicate process of translation that went far beyond language to encompass culture, expectation, and hope. My father observed these activities with the bewildered tolerance of a man watching his daughter collect butterflies. Useful, perhaps, but hardly substantial. When I announced my intention to major in international studies, he launched into a speech about practical careers and financial security, his voice gaining volume as he described the folly of pursuing subjects that produced nothing tangible. "You have a brain for business," he insisted, gesturing toward the architectural drawings spread across his desk. "Help me build this company into something that will outlast us both." But I had already fallen in love with the impossible complexity of human negotiation, the way careful listening could unlock doors that force would only reinforce. The scholarship to Georgetown School of Foreign Service arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, the envelope thick with promise and possibility. I read the letter twice before finding my father in the garage, where he was reviewing construction schedules with his foreman. The pride in my voice was unmistakable as I announced the news, but his response landed like cold water. "Foreign service," he repeated, testing the words as if they might reveal hidden meaning. "So you'll work for the government, pushing papers from one desk to another while other people create actual value?" His dismissal stung more than anger would have, the casual way he reduced my dreams to clerical work. Georgetown's campus felt like stepping into a different world, where professors had served as ambassadors and classmates carried passports thick with stamps from countries I'd only read about. The coursework demanded everything I had to give. Case studies that required parsing centuries of cultural nuance, simulations where the wrong word choice could escalate imaginary conflicts into very real consequences. My grades reflected the intensity of my commitment, but when I called home each week, my father's questions focused on practical matters. Was I eating enough? Did I need money? Had I reconsidered business school? He never asked about the courses that were reshaping my understanding of how the world actually functioned. The summer internship at the State Department felt like stepping through a portal into purpose. The building hummed with urgent energy, career diplomats moving between meetings that would determine trade agreements, immigration policies, and responses to international crises. I was assigned to the office of the legal advisor, where treaties were dissected line by line and international law was applied to situations that defied easy categorization. The work was meticulous, demanding, and absolutely thrilling. My supervisor, Ambassador Sarah Chen, had spent decades negotiating agreements in some of the world's most challenging environments. She spoke with the measured precision of someone who understood that words carried the weight of nations, and she took time to explain why seemingly minor clauses could determine whether agreements succeeded or failed. Diplomacy, she told me during one late evening review session, is the art of making the impossible seem inevitable. But it requires patience most people can't imagine and precision most people wouldn't attempt. The first real test came during my second week, when a trade dispute between American manufacturers and their European counterparts threatened to unravel months of careful negotiation. The legal language was dense with technical specifications and historical precedents, but buried within the complexity was a fundamental misunderstanding about intellectual property rights that had poisoned every subsequent discussion. I spent 3 sleepless nights researching comparable cases, mapping the evolution of trade law across both continents, and drafting a memo that outlined potential compromise positions. Ambassador Chen read my analysis with the concentration of someone examining evidence in a criminal trial. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from polite interest to genuine attention. "This is thorough work," she said, and something in her tone suggested the compliment carried more weight than her words revealed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I want you to sit in on tomorrow's conference call with the European team. The call lasted 4 hours, voices crackling across time zones as lawyers and trade specialists worked through scenarios that could affect millions of jobs. When my suggested compromise became the foundation for resumed negotiations, I felt something click into place. a sense of purpose that had been searching for its proper shape. That evening, I called my parents, excitement bubbling over as I described how international agreements were crafted through layers of detail most people never considered. My mother listened with the focused attention she brought to her students' presentations, asking questions that demonstrated her investment in my success. But when my father took the phone, his response deflated the moment. "Sounds like complicated paperwork," he said, his tone suggesting that complexity was a failing rather than a feature. "I hope they're paying you well for all that reading." The conversation ended with familiar pleasantries, but I hung up feeling as if I'd tried to describe a symphony to someone who could only hear noise. Senior year brought opportunities that felt like gifts wrapped in challenge. My thesis examined the role of cultural liaison officers in post-conflict reconstruction, focusing on how understanding local customs could determine whether international aid succeeded or backfired catastrophically. The research required interviews with officials who had worked in Afghanistan, Iraq, and South Sudan, conversations that revealed how often well-intentioned policies had failed because they ignored the human complexities that shaped every interaction. Professor Martinez, who had served as an ambassador to 3 different countries, called my work exceptionally mature and recommended me for the prestigious Foreign Service Officer test. The FSOT represented everything I had been working toward, a comprehensive examination that would determine eligibility for a career in diplomacy. The test covered everything from world history to economics, from consular procedures to crisis management. And passing required not just knowledge, but the ability to synthesize information under extreme pressure. I spent months preparing, reviewing case studies and memorizing protocols, understanding that this single exam would determine whether my dreams had substance or were merely elaborate fantasies. The testing center in downtown Washington was filled with candidates who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to academic success. We sat in rows of computer terminals, answering questions that required not just factual knowledge, but cultural sensitivity and strategic thinking. The essay portion asked us to develop policy recommendations for a fictional crisis involving refugees, trade disputes, and environmental concerns, all while maintaining diplomatic relationships with countries whose interests directly conflicted with American objectives. I wrote with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every word would be evaluated by professionals who had spent careers navigating similar challenges in the real world. Results arrived 6 weeks later in an email that felt too casual for news that would reshape my future. I had passed with scores that placed me in the top 15% of candidates, qualifying for the next phase of selection that would include oral assessments, security clearance reviews, and psychological evaluations. The acceptance rate for foreign service officers hovered around 3%, but I had cleared the first hurdle toward a career that suddenly felt possible rather than merely hoped for. My parents received the news with characteristic divergence. My mother cried with relief and pride, understanding that her daughter had achieved something genuinely difficult and meaningful. My father nodded approvingly and asked whether government salaries were competitive with private sector opportunities, as if my career choice was primarily an economic calculation, rather than a calling that had been growing stronger with each passing year. "It's stable work," he conceded, and I realized that stability was the highest compliment he could offer to employment that didn't involve creating something physical and permanent. The oral assessment took place in a nondescript government building where candidates faced panels of current foreign service officers who evaluated everything from policy knowledge to crisis management capabilities. We participated in group exercises that simulated embassy emergency planning, individual interviews that probed our understanding of American interests and values, and written assessments that required balancing competing priorities under impossible time constraints. The process felt like an intensive course in applied diplomacy, and I left each session both exhausted and energized by the intellectual demands. 3 months later, another email changed everything. I had been selected for the Foreign Service, with assignment to the economic cone that focused on trade, development, and international business relationships. The class of new officers would begin training at the Foreign Service Institute in Arlington, Virginia in September, marking the official beginning of careers that could span decades and continents. I read the message 3 times before the reality settled in. I was going to be a diplomat.
Training at FSI felt like drinking from a fire hose filled with information essential for representing American interests abroad. We studied everything from visa procedures to crisis management, from cultural sensitivity to security protocols. The days began before dawn and ended long after dinner, packed with lectures, simulations, and practical exercises that would determine our readiness for overseas assignment. My classmates came from diverse backgrounds: former military officers and Peace Corps volunteers, lawyers, and journalists, all united by a shared commitment to public service that transcended personal ambition. The economics courses were particularly challenging, requiring us to master trade theory, development finance, and commercial advocacy, while understanding how these technical subjects served broader diplomatic objectives. We learned to analyze foreign markets for American businesses, to negotiate bilateral investment treaties, and to represent U.S. commercial interests in environments where economic policy was inseparable from political relationships. The work demanded both analytical rigor and cultural fluency, the ability to translate complex financial concepts across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Language training added another layer of complexity to an already demanding schedule. I had tested into advanced Spanish and was beginning intermediate Arabic, understanding that linguistic capability would determine not just my effectiveness, but my potential assignments. The immersion methodology was intense, requiring us to conduct increasingly sophisticated conversations about policy topics while mastering grammar and vocabulary that would allow us to represent American positions with precision and cultural sensitivity. By the end of 6 months, I was dreaming in Spanish and thinking in diplomatic frameworks that had become second nature. My first assignment was to the economic section of the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, where I would focus on trade facilitation and commercial advocacy for American businesses seeking opportunities in the Mexican market. The position required me to serve as a bridge between the American business community and Mexican government officials, helping to resolve disputes, identify opportunities, and maintain the commercial relationships that underpin broader bilateral cooperation. It was exactly the kind of challenging, consequential work I had hoped for, and I approached it with the enthusiasm of someone finally able to apply years of preparation to real problems. Mexico City assaulted the senses, with its combination of ancient grandeur and modern chaos, where pre-Columbian ruins stood alongside glass towers that reflected the complicated relationship between tradition and progress. The embassy occupied a fortress-like compound in the heart of the city, its walls both protecting and symbolizing the complex relationship between two countries whose fates were intertwined by geography and economics. My office looked out onto busy streets where vendors sold everything from fresh fruit to cell phone accessories, a constant reminder that the policies we crafted would affect millions of people whose daily lives rarely intersected with diplomatic proceedings. The commercial work proved both more complex and more satisfying than I had anticipated. American companies seeking to establish operations in Mexico faced labyrinthine regulatory requirements that varied by industry, region, and often the particular officials responsible for enforcement. My job was to help them navigate these challenges while ensuring that their investments served broader American interests in promoting fair trade and economic development. The work required understanding not just Mexican law, but the cultural context that shaped how regulations were interpreted and applied. One of my first major cases involved an American agricultural equipment manufacturer that had been trying for 2 years to establish a distribution network in central Mexico. The company had faced endless bureaucratic delays, conflicting regulatory interpretations, and what appeared to be deliberate obstruction from local officials who favored Mexican competitors. The CEO had contacted the embassy in frustration, threatening to abandon the Mexican market entirely and relocate planned investments to Colombia or Brazil. I spent weeks researching the regulatory landscape, meeting with Mexican officials, and analyzing comparable cases to understand why this particular company was encountering such resistance. The breakthrough came during a dinner with a senior official from the Ministry of Economy who explained that local concerns about American agricultural technology centered on potential impacts on small farmers who formed the backbone of rural communities. The company's equipment was so efficient that widespread adoption could displace thousands of agricultural workers, creating political problems for officials who depended on rural support. The solution required creative thinking that addressed both economic efficiency and social stability. Working with the American company, I developed a proposal that included job training programs for displaced workers, technical assistance for small farmers who wanted to improve their operations, and community development investments in areas where the equipment would have the greatest impact.
The package transformed a purely commercial arrangement into a development partnership that served Mexican political interests while opening markets for American products. The agreement was signed 6 months later, creating a template that would be used for dozens of similar investments. My father learned about the success through a brief phone call, where I tried to explain how trade policy affected real people's lives. His response was characteristically practical. "So this company will make money and hire Mexican workers," he summarized. "That's good business." But there was something missing from his tone, a failure to grasp that the negotiation had prevented a diplomatic dispute, preserved jobs on both sides of the border, and created a framework for future cooperation. To him, it was a business deal. To me, it was statecraft. The refugee crisis that brought Marcus into my life began with a phone call at 3 a.m. from the State Department's Operations Center. Syrian refugees had been gathering at the Mexican border for weeks, seeking asylum in the United States after fleeing conflict that had already displaced millions across the Middle East. Mexico was struggling to house and process the growing number of asylum seekers, while American immigration authorities faced legal challenges to existing policies that had created a humanitarian backlog of enormous proportions. The situation required immediate diplomatic attention to prevent a crisis that could damage relationships with Mexico, while failing to address that despite American need for low-cost labor, less welcomed excess workers regarded as a burden on social systems. Marcus was the UNHCR field coordinator who had been working with refugee populations across Central America for 5 years. We met in a conference room at the Mexican Foreign Ministry, where representatives from 6 different organizations were trying to coordinate responses to a situation that was evolving faster than any bureaucracy could manage. He spoke with quiet authority about international refugee law, drawing on experience in camps from Jordan to Colombia, and his presentation cut through political posturing to focus on practical solutions that could actually be implemented given limited resources and competing priorities. Our first collaborative effort involved establishing a temporary processing center that could expedite asylum claims while ensuring that refugees received adequate housing and medical care during what might be extended waiting periods. The project required coordination between American immigration authorities, Mexican social services, and international aid organizations, each with different procedures, priorities, and legal constraints. Marcus brought field experience that complemented my understanding of bureaucratic requirements, and together we developed protocols that satisfied regulatory demands while treating refugees as human beings rather than administrative problems. The work was exhausting and emotionally demanding, requiring 18-hour days spent mediating between agencies that spoke different languages, both literally and figuratively. But gradually, the system began to function. Asylum claims that had been backlogged for months were processed within weeks. Families who had been living in improvised shelters were moved to facilities with adequate sanitation, education for children, and healthcare for vulnerable populations. The crisis didn't disappear, but it became manageable, and the cooperation between American and Mexican authorities created a framework that could be adapted for future challenges. Marcus and I discovered that our professional partnership had evolved into something more personal during a quiet dinner after particularly difficult negotiations. We were both exhausted, emotionally drained by weeks of confronting human suffering that governments seemed unable to address with the urgency the situation demanded.
But we had also seen how dedicated people working across institutional boundaries could actually solve problems that seemed impossible when viewed from any single perspective. The attraction between us grew from shared purpose as much as personal chemistry, and we began building a relationship that could survive the demands of careers that required constant travel and emotional investment in other people's crises. 2 years later, when the German chancellor specifically requested my participation in climate negotiations that would determine international responses to environmental challenges, I felt the validation I had been seeking since childhood. The invitation came through official diplomatic channels, acknowledging my work on environmental trade issues and recognition that climate policy was inseparable from economic development. Foreign ministers from 12 countries had agreed to participate in discussions that could establish frameworks for reducing carbon emissions while maintaining economic growth, and my expertise in trade environmental linkages was considered essential for reaching agreements that could actually be implemented given limited resources and competing priorities. Our first collaborative effort involved establishing a temporary processing center that could expedite asylum claims while ensuring that refugees received adequate housing and medical care during what might be extended waiting periods. The project required coordination between American immigration authorities, Mexican social services, and international aid organizations, each with different procedures, priorities, and legal constraints. Marcus brought field experience that complemented my understanding of bureaucratic requirements, and together we developed protocols that satisfied regulatory demands while treating refugees as human beings rather than administrative problems. The work was exhausting and emotionally demanding, requiring 18-hour days spent mediating between agencies that spoke different languages, both literally and figuratively. But gradually, the system began to function. Asylum claims that had been backlogged for months were processed within weeks. Families who had been living in improvised shelters were moved to facilities with adequate sanitation, education for children, and health care for vulnerable populations. The crisis didn't disappear, but it became manageable, and the cooperation between American and Mexican authorities created a framework that could be adapted for future challenges. Marcus and I discovered that our professional partnership had evolved into something more personal during a quiet dinner after a particularly difficult negotiations. We were both exhausted, emotionally drained by weeks of confronting human suffering that governments seemed unable to address with the urgency the situation demanded. But we had also seen how dedicated people working across institutional boundaries could actually solve problems that seemed impossible when viewed from any single perspective. The attraction between us grew from shared purpose as much as personal chemistry, and we began building a relationship that could survive the demands of careers that required constant travel and emotional investment in other people's crises. 2 years later, when the German chancellor specifically requested my participation in climate negotiations that would determine international responses to environmental challenges, I felt the validation I had been seeking since childhood. The invitation came through official diplomatic channels, acknowledging my work on environmental trade issues and recognition that climate policy was inseparable from economic development. Foreign ministers from 12 countries had agreed to participate in discussions that could establish frameworks for reducing carbon emissions while maintaining economic growth, and my expertise in trade environmental linkages was considered essential for reaching agreements that could actually be implemented. The negotiations took place in Budapest, where representatives from some of the world's largest economies spent 2 weeks working through the technical details that would determine whether climate commitments remained aspirational or became enforceable obligations. I worked with teams from Germany, Japan, and Canada to develop carbon pricing mechanisms that could be integrated into existing trade agreements, creating economic incentives for environmental protection while ensuring that developing countries weren't penalized for circumstances beyond their control. The breakthrough came when I proposed treating carbon emissions as a trade issue rather than purely environmental concern, allowing negotiations to proceed under World Trade Organization frameworks that already had enforcement mechanisms. The approach required complex legal analysis and careful diplomatic coordination, but it transformed abstract climate commitments into concrete trade policies that could be monitored, measured, and enforced through existing international institutions. 12 countries signed the Budapest Accords 3 months later, establishing the first legally binding international framework for carbon pricing in global trade. When I called home to share the news, my mother wept with pride and asked detailed questions about how the agreement would affect global environmental policy. But my father's response reduced the accomplishment to simple terms that missed its significance entirely. "Sounds like a lot of meetings and paperwork," he said dismissively. "I hope they paid you well for all that traveling." His inability to recognize the importance of preventing international environmental catastrophe through careful negotiation felt like a physical blow, and I realized that no achievement would ever be sufficient to earn the respect I had been seeking my entire life. The engagement party was meant to be a celebration, an opportunity for our families to meet and for Marcus to be officially welcomed into the extended network of relationships that had shaped my childhood. My father had insisted on hosting the event at the country club where he was a founding member, eager to display the success he had achieved through decades of building Chicago's expanding skyline. The guest list included business partners, political figures, and family friends who had watched me grow up and were curious about the man I had chosen to marry. Marcus handled the social dynamics with the diplomatic skill that had made him effective in refugee camps and international negotiations. He spoke knowledgeably about construction techniques with my father's business associates, discussed literature with my mother's teaching colleagues, and answered questions about his humanitarian work with the kind of specific detail that demonstrated genuine expertise rather than rehearsed talking points. I watched him navigate the evening with growing appreciation for his ability to connect with people whose backgrounds and interests were completely different from his own professional world. But the conversation shifted when one of my father's longtime friends asked about my work, expressing the kind of polite interest that expected simple answers to complex questions. I found myself explaining how international trade agreements affected everything from food prices to job creation, how diplomatic negotiations prevented conflicts that could cost thousands of lives, and how the Budapest Accords represented a fundamental shift in how countries would address environmental challenges that transcended national boundaries. The explanation was longer than typical dinner party conversation, but the subject demanded detail to be understood properly. My father listened with growing irritation, his jaw tightening in the way I recognized from childhood disagreements. When I finished describing the significance of the carbon pricing mechanisms we had developed, he laughed with the kind of dismissive humor that was meant to deflate rather than amuse. "Meaningless bureaucratic nonsense," he declared, his voice carrying across the table until conversations at nearby tables paused to listen. "Playing diplomat while real people do real work." The words landed like accusations, reducing years of preparation and achievement to elaborate games played by people too impractical for meaningful employment. The silence that followed was charged with embarrassment, confusion, and the kind of social awkwardness that occurs when private family dynamics explode in public settings. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation, not just at being dismissed so casually, but at having my life's work characterized as meaningless in front of people whose opinions had shaped my childhood understanding of success and failure. Marcus sat perfectly still beside me, his expression controlled, but his tension visible to anyone who knew him well enough to read the subtle signs. What happened next changed everything. Marcus set down his wine glass with deliberate care, looked directly at my father with the kind of steady gaze he used in crisis situations, and spoke with quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "She's the reason 12 nations signed the Budapest Accords," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the work firsthand. "The German chancellor specifically requested her by name for the climate negotiations."
The words fell into silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would reshape relationships and understanding that had seemed fixed for decades. My father's face went through a series of expressions, from defensive anger to confused reassessment to something that might have been recognition. For the first time in my memory, he had no immediate response to information that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of meaningful work. The silence stretched across the table while everyone waited for him to speak, to laugh dismissively, or to find some way to minimize what Marcus had revealed about the scope and significance of my professional accomplishments. But the silence continued, heavy with the weight of years spent diminishing achievements that deserved celebration and dismissing expertise that had earned international recognition. I realized in that moment that I no longer needed his approval or understanding to validate choices that had brought purpose and satisfaction to my life.
The work spoke for itself, and people who mattered in my professional world understood its importance, even if my father never would. Marcus had given me an unexpected gift, not by defending me, but by stating facts that revealed how thoroughly my father had misunderstood the daughter he thought he knew. The evening continued with strained politeness, conversations resuming in careful tones that avoided the subjects that had caused such discomfort. But something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics between us, and I found myself observing my father with new clarity. He was a man who had achieved remarkable success within the world he understood, but his definition of meaningful work was so narrow that I couldn't encompass the complexity of international relations or the significance of preventing global conflicts through patient negotiation. His limitations weren't malicious, but they were absolute, and I finally understood that seeking his approval had been a fool's errand from the beginning. 3 months later, another invitation arrived that would provide the final proof that my career had achieved the kind of international significance my father could never dismiss. The European Union was convening a special commission to address migration challenges that were destabilizing politics across the continent, and they specifically requested American participation in developing policies that could address both humanitarian concerns and political realities. My name appeared on a list of preferred negotiators, recognition that my work on refugee issues had earned respect from officials who had no obligation to include American perspectives in European policy discussions. The commission meetings took place in Brussels, where representatives from 27 countries spent 6 weeks developing frameworks for refugee resettlement, economic integration, and burden sharing that could address the largest population displacement since World War II. The work required everything I had learned about international negotiation, cultural sensitivity, and the delicate balance between competing national interests and shared humanitarian obligations. We were literally redesigning how democratic societies would respond to global challenges that threatened both human rights and political stability. My role focused on economic integration policies, developing systems that could help refugees become productive members of their new communities while addressing legitimate concerns about job competition and social services. The work required understanding labor markets, education systems, and cultural dynamics across dozens of different national contexts, then creating policies flexible enough to be adapted to local conditions while maintaining common standards that could facilitate cooperation between countries. It was exactly the kind of complex, consequential work that had drawn me to diplomacy in the first place. The breakthrough came when I proposed treating refugee integration as an economic development opportunity rather than a humanitarian burden, creating incentive structures that would reward communities for successful resettlement while providing resources needed to make integration actually work. The model had been tested in smaller contexts, but scaling it to a continental level required innovative financing mechanisms and unprecedented cooperation between national governments, local authorities, and civil society organizations. The framework we developed became known as the Brussels Protocol, establishing new standards for international cooperation on migration issues. When I called home to share news that the protocol had been adopted by all 27 EU member countries, my mother responded with the kind of detailed questions that demonstrated her understanding of the achievement's significance. But my father's response revealed how little had changed in his fundamental assessment of my career. Government work, he said dismissively. At least you're getting good travel opportunities. His inability to recognize that I had helped reshape international policy that would affect millions of people's lives felt like a familiar disappointment, but one that no longer carried the emotional weight it once had. The wedding planning process became an opportunity to establish new boundaries around our relationship, making clear that while I valued my father's presence in my life, I would no longer accept his dismissive characterization of work that had earned international recognition. Marcus and I decided to hold the ceremony in Chicago, partly to honor my family, but mainly to celebrate our partnership in the city where I had first learned that words could carry the weight of nations. The guest list included diplomatic colleagues, refugee advocates, and development specialists whose presence would testify to the significance of careers my father had never understood. The night before the ceremony, my father appeared at my hotel room door carrying a newspaper folded to an article about the Brussels Protocol. His expression was different from any I could remember, uncertain rather than dismissive, seeking understanding rather than asserting authority. "I read about this thing you helped negotiate," he said carefully, holding the paper like evidence in a trial where he wasn't sure of the verdict. "They say it will help millions of people." The admission represented the closest he had ever come to acknowledging that my career might have value beyond the metrics he traditionally used to measure success. We talked for an hour about the work I had been doing, the challenges of international negotiation, and the satisfaction that came from solving problems that seemed impossible when viewed from any single national perspective. For the first time, he listened with genuine attention rather than polite tolerance, asking questions that suggested he was trying to understand rather than waiting for an opportunity to redirect the conversation toward more practical concerns. When he left, he touched my shoulder with the kind of awkward affection that suggested emotions he didn't have words to express.
The wedding ceremony took place in a historic chapel where the morning light filtered through stained glass windows that had witnessed decades of promises made and futures launched. Marcus and I had written our own vows, acknowledging the unusual demands of careers that required us to care deeply about other people's crises while maintaining the emotional resources necessary for our own relationship. When the minister asked who would support our union, my father stood with the rest of our families, his voice joining the chorus that promised to help us navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. The reception featured toasts from colleagues who had worked with us in refugee camps and negotiation halls, people whose understanding of our work came from shared experience rather than polite curiosity. Ambassador Chen spoke about the importance of public service that transcended personal ambition, while Marcus's supervisor from the UNHCR described how humanitarian work required both technical expertise and emotional resilience that few people could sustain over entire careers. The speeches painted a picture of lives dedicated to purposes larger than individual success, and I realized that we had built a community of people who understood what we were trying to accomplish in ways my father might never fully grasp. But the most meaningful moment came when my father asked for the microphone, rising slowly with the careful dignity of a man who rarely spoke publicly about personal matters. His voice was steady but quieter than usual, as he acknowledged that he had spent years failing to understand the importance of his daughter's work. "I built buildings," he said simply. "She builds bridges between countries. Both kinds of construction matter, but hers might last longer." The admission represented a fundamental shift in perspective, recognition that meaningful work could take forms he had never considered, and that my daughter had achieved something genuinely significant in ways he was only beginning to appreciate. 6 months after the wedding, another invitation arrived that would provide the ultimate vindication for a career built on patient negotiation and cultural understanding. The United Nations was organizing a special session on global governance reform, and they specifically requested my participation as one of 12 experts who would draft recommendations for addressing international challenges that exceeded any single country's ability to manage effectively. The invitation acknowledged my work on trade,
migration, and environmental policy as evidence of the kind of cross-cutting expertise needed to tackle problems that defied traditional diplomatic categories. The sessions took place in New York, where representatives from every continent spent 3 months developing frameworks that could address everything from pandemic response to climate adaptation to technological governance that respected both innovation and human rights. My role involved synthesizing economic, environmental, and humanitarian concerns into policy recommendations that could be implemented across different political systems while maintaining democratic accountability and respect for human dignity. It was the kind of work that represented the culmination of everything I had been preparing for since that first day I announced my intention to help people understand each other. The final report included recommendations that would reshape how international organizations approached global challenges, establishing new mechanisms for cooperation that could respond to crises with the speed they demanded while maintaining the careful deliberation that democracy required. My contributions focused on creating economic incentives for international cooperation, developing frameworks that would make shared governments profitable for participating countries, while ensuring that benefits were distributed fairly across different levels of economic development. The work required everything I had learned about negotiation, policy analysis, and cultural sensitivity, applied to challenges that would determine whether future generations inherited a more stable and equitable world. When the report was published, it received coverage in newspapers across 6 continents and was translated into dozens of languages for distribution to policymakers, academic institutions, and civil society organizations that would be responsible for implementing its recommendations. The recognition felt surreal after years of working on issues that rarely attracted public attention, but it also validated a career choice that had sometimes felt like swimming against currents that carried most of my peers toward more obviously lucrative and prestigious directions. My father learned about the UN report through a phone call from my mother, who had been tracking media coverage with the dedicated attention she brought to following her students' achievements. When he called me later that day, his voice carried a different quality than any conversation I could remember. "The newspaper says you helped write a plan for how countries should work together," he said carefully. "They interviewed the Secretary General about it." The recognition in his tone suggested that he was finally beginning to understand that my career had achieved something more than elaborate paperwork and international travel. We talked for over an hour about the challenges of global governance, the difficulty of creating policies that could work across different political systems, and the satisfaction that came from addressing problems that affected millions of people's daily lives, even when they never knew that solutions were being crafted on their behalf. For the first time in our relationship, he seemed genuinely curious about the technical aspects of my work, asking questions that suggested he was trying to understand complexity rather than looking for ways to simplify it into more familiar categories. The conversation ended with an invitation to visit Chicago for a dinner that would include several of his business associates who had expressed interest in learning more about international trade policy and its effects on American manufacturing. The invitation represented a fundamental shift in how he viewed my expertise, from meaningless bureaucracy to knowledge that might actually be valuable to people whose opinions he respected. When I accepted, I realized that we had finally found common ground built not on his approval of my choices, but on his recognition that those choices had achieved something that demanded respect according to any reasonable measure of professional success. The dinner took place at the same country club where my engagement party had ended in such awkward silence. But this time, my father introduced me as an expert on international policy whose work had influenced agreements that affected global trade, environmental protection, and humanitarian assistance.
The business leaders asked sophisticated questions about how trade negotiations worked, what factors determined whether international agreements succeeded or failed, and how they could better understand policy developments that would affect their industries. I found myself explaining concepts that had become second nature, translating diplomatic complexity into terms that made sense to people whose primary concerns were practical rather than theoretical. Afterward, as we walked to the parking lot under stars that seemed brighter than I remembered from childhood, my father spoke with the careful deliberation of someone choosing words that would carry weight beyond their immediate context. "I was wrong about your work," he said simply. "I didn't understand what you were trying to build." The admission was more valuable than any earlier praise would have been, representing genuine recognition rather than obligatory support. When he asked whether I was happy with the choices I had made, I could answer with complete honesty that I couldn't imagine any other path that would have provided the same sense of purpose and accomplishment. The story could end there, with reconciliation and mutual respect finally established after years of misunderstanding and disappointed expectations. But life rarely provides such neat conclusions, and the relationship between fathers and daughters who choose unconventional paths requires ongoing negotiation rather than single moments of recognition. What changed wasn't his fundamental personality or my need for approval, but our mutual understanding that meaningful work takes forms that can't always be measured by traditional metrics of success. The call came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray February day when Washington's monuments disappeared into mist that clung to the Potomac like unresolved grief. My secure phone buzzed with the distinctive ring that meant crisis, emergency, something that couldn't wait for normal business hours or proper diplomatic channels. Ambassador Chen's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone who had delivered bad news across time zones for 30 years, but even her practiced calm couldn't disguise the magnitude of what she was about to request. "Elena, we need you in Geneva immediately," she said, using the tone that preceded assignments no one wanted but everyone understood were necessary. "The Syrian peace talks are collapsing, and the Russians are threatening to withdraw from the process entirely. The secretary specifically asked for you to join the mediation team." The weight of that request settled in my chest like cold stone. The Geneva talks represented the international community's last coordinated attempt to end a conflict that had already displaced millions and threatened to destabilize an entire region. If they failed, the humanitarian catastrophe would expand beyond any capacity to contain. I was packed and airborne within 6 hours, carrying briefing files that contained 7 years of failed negotiations, broken ceasefires, and diplomatic initiatives that had accomplished little beyond providing forums for adversaries to articulate their irreconcilable positions. The flight to Switzerland gave me time to review the latest intelligence assessments, casualty reports, and political analyses that painted a picture of a conflict so complex that resolution seemed impossible through any mechanism short of exhaustion or total military victory by one side or another. My role would be to find compromise positions that could satisfy governments whose primary shared characteristics were their mutual distrust. Geneva's Palais des Nations carried the weight of diplomatic history in its marble corridors, where delegates from around the world had spent decades crafting agreements that either prevented conflicts or failed spectacularly to address the underlying tensions that made peace impossible. The building hummed with the quiet intensity of translators, security personnel, and career diplomats who understood that the conversations taking place behind closed doors could determine whether millions of people lived or died, whether refugee camps became permanent cities, whether an entire generation grew up knowing only war. The mediation team included representatives from 6 countries, each bringing their own national interests and regional concerns to discussions that required setting aside short-term political calculations in favor of long-term stability that might benefit everyone if it could actually be achieved. The Russian delegation consisted of seasoned negotiators who had spent decades managing their country's Middle Eastern relationships, while the American team brought military advisors, humanitarian specialists, and regional experts whose analysis had shaped policy recommendations that previous administrations had either ignored or implemented half-heartedly. My counterpart on the Russian team was Dr. Dmitry Volkov, a man whose academic credentials disguised sharp political instincts and whose fluent English carried traces of an accent that became more pronounced when discussions grew heated. He had spent 15 years working on Middle Eastern policy, first as a university researcher and later as a government advisor whose recommendations had influenced Moscow's approach to regional conflicts from Libya to Afghanistan. Our first meeting took place in a conference room overlooking Lake Geneva,
where the winter light reflected off water that seemed to mirror the frozen state of negotiations we were attempting to restart. The initial sessions were exercises in diplomatic theater, each side restating positions that had been articulated hundreds of times over the previous 7 years. The Syrian government insisted on maintaining sovereignty over territories they claimed, while opposition groups demanded political transitions that would eliminate the current leadership structure entirely. Regional powers supported different factions based on calculations that had more to do with geopolitical competition than Syrian welfare, while humanitarian organizations pressed for ceasefire agreements that could allow aid delivery to populations that had been cut off from assistance for months. The breakthrough came during an informal dinner where protocol was relaxed enough to allow genuine conversation rather than scripted position statements.
Dr. Volkov and I found ourselves discussing the economic dimensions of post-conflict reconstruction, areas where Russian expertise in resource development and American experience in institutional building could potentially complement each other rather than compete. The conversation revealed that both countries had legitimate interests in Syrian stability that could be served through cooperation rather than zero-sum competition, but only if we could identify mechanisms that protected those interests while addressing the humanitarian concerns that had originally motivated international intervention. Working through interpreters and cultural liaisons, we began developing frameworks that treated the Syrian conflict as a development challenge rather than purely a security problem. The approach required understanding how economic incentives could be structured to reward cooperation between former adversaries, how reconstruction projects could create employment opportunities for populations that had lost everything, and how international assistance could be coordinated to avoid the duplication and competition that had characterized earlier relief efforts. The work was technically complex and politically sensitive, requiring us to navigate between competing national interests while maintaining focus on practical solutions that could actually be implemented. The compromise that eventually emerged from 6 weeks of intensive negotiation wasn't elegant or comprehensive, but it addressed the core issues that had prevented earlier agreements from taking hold. The framework established autonomous zones that could provide local governance while preserving nominal Syrian sovereignty, created economic development councils that included representation from all major communities, and established monitoring mechanisms that could verify compliance without requiring the kind of intrusive international presence that had been unacceptable to the Syrian government. Most importantly, it included enforcement provisions that made violations costly enough to discourage while providing face-saving mechanisms that allowed parties to adjust their positions without admitting complete defeat. The signing ceremony took place in the same hall where the Geneva Conventions had been negotiated 70 years earlier, a deliberate reminder that international law could evolve to address new challenges while maintaining the principles that had prevented larger conflicts since the end of the Second World War. Representatives from 15 countries witnessed the agreement, understanding that implementation would be far more difficult than negotiation, but recognizing that even imperfect progress was preferable to the continued deterioration that had characterized the previous 7 years of conflict. My father learned about the Geneva Accords through television coverage that featured brief interviews with negotiation team members, including a 30-second clip where I explained how economic development could serve peace-building objectives more effectively than purely political agreements. When he called later that evening, his voice carried a quality I had never heard before, something that might have been awe mixed with belated recognition that his daughter had been working on problems whose complexity he was only beginning to understand. "They showed you on the news talking about this peace agreement," he said carefully, as if testing whether the words accurately described what he had witnessed. "The reporter said it might end a war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people." The numbers seemed to affect him in ways that my earlier explanations about trade policy and environmental agreements had not, perhaps because human casualties provided a metric he could understand more readily than carbon pricing or refugee integration protocols. When I confirmed that the agreement represented a genuine chance for reducing violence and improving conditions for Syrian civilians, he was quiet for a long time before asking whether I was proud of the work I had been able to accomplish. The question caught me off guard, partly because he had never asked about my feelings regarding professional achievements, and partly because I realized that pride was exactly what I felt,
not in the self-congratulatory sense, but in the deeper satisfaction that comes from contributing to something larger than individual success. Working on the Geneva Accords had required everything I had learned about negotiation, cultural sensitivity, and the patient work of building trust between adversaries who had legitimate reasons to distrust each other. The agreement wouldn't solve all of Syria's problems, but it created mechanisms for addressing them through dialogue rather than continued warfare. The implementation phase proved even more challenging than the negotiation, requiring constant communication between Geneva, Damascus, Moscow, and Washington to address the inevitable misunderstandings and disputes that arose as abstract agreements were translated into concrete policies, affecting millions of people's daily lives. My role evolved into something resembling diplomatic troubleshooting, working with local officials, international aid organizations, and military commanders to resolve conflicts that could undermine the broader framework if they weren't addressed quickly and decisively. The most difficult moment came 6 months after the signing, when fighting broke out between groups that had supposedly agreed to the ceasefire arrangements. The violence threatened to unravel the entire agreement and provide justification for parties who had never supported the Geneva framework to withdraw from processes they had joined reluctantly. Emergency consultations were convened in Geneva, but the real work took place through secure phone calls and encrypted communications that allowed negotiators to address specific grievances before they escalated into broader confrontations that could destroy months of careful diplomatic progress. Working with Dr. Volkov and our Syrian counterparts, I helped develop rapid response mechanisms that could address ceasefire violations within hours rather than weeks, providing all parties with confidence that agreements would be enforced fairly and consistently rather than selectively applied based on political considerations. The system required unprecedented cooperation between American and Russian intelligence services, Syrian government forces, and opposition militias, but it worked well enough to prevent the kind of escalatory cycles that had characterized the conflict's earlier phases. The success of the rapid response system led to requests for similar mechanisms in other conflict zones, where international mediation efforts had struggled with the same fundamental challenge of translating negotiated agreements into sustainable peace processes. The methodology we had developed in Geneva was adapted for use in Yemen, where Saudi and Iranian proxies were fighting a war that had created the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where ethnic conflicts and resource competition had displaced millions while attracting minimal international attention. Each adaptation required understanding the specific cultural, political, and economic factors that shaped local conflicts, but the basic framework remained consistent. Economic incentives for cooperation, monitoring mechanisms that could verify compliance, and enforcement procedures that imposed real costs for violations while providing face-saving mechanisms that allowed parties to adjust their positions without admitting complete defeat. My reputation within the diplomatic community evolved from competent negotiator to specialist in post-conflict reconstruction, someone who could be counted on to understand both the technical requirements of peacebuilding and the political sensitivities that determined whether agreements survived their first contact with implementation challenges.
The work was demanding and often frustrating, but it provided the kind of purpose and professional satisfaction that made the personal sacrifices worthwhile. Marcus understood better than anyone the emotional costs of caring deeply about other people's suffering while maintaining the psychological distance necessary for effective intervention. The African assignment that would define the next phase of my career began with another early morning phone call, this time from the Secretary of State's office, with a request that carried the weight of presidential attention. Ethnic violence in the Central African Republic had escalated beyond the capacity of regional peacekeeping forces to contain, and the international community was debating whether to authorize a full military intervention or attempt diplomatic solutions that had failed repeatedly over the previous decade. My experience with post-conflict economic development was considered essential for any approach that prioritized long-term stability over short-term crisis management. The flight to Bangui took me across time zones and cultural boundaries that separated comfortable diplomatic facilities from the reality of conflict zones, where theoretical policies encountered human consequences that couldn't be abstracted or minimized.
The capital city carried scars from years of violence, with buildings that showed bullet holes, streets that emptied after dark, and a population that had learned to navigate between competing armed groups whose control over territory shifted based on factors that outsiders struggled to understand or predict. The United Nations compound, where I would be based for the next 8 months, was surrounded by walls topped with razor wire, a physical barrier that symbolized the distance between international intervention and local communities, whose cooperation would determine whether any peace-building effort could succeed. Inside the compound, representatives from dozens of countries worked on humanitarian assistance, security coordination, and political mediation that required understanding ethnic divisions, resource competition, and historical grievances that dated back to colonial boundaries drawn by Europeans who had never visited the territories they were dividing. My role involved working with community leaders from different ethnic groups to develop economic programs that could provide alternatives to the resource extraction and territorial control that had fueled decades of conflict. The approach required understanding how traditional governance systems had been disrupted by colonial administration, how post-independence politics had exacerbated ethnic tensions, and how international intervention had often inadvertently strengthened the very dynamics it was intended to address. The work demanded cultural sensitivity, technical expertise, and the kind of patient relationship building that couldn't be accomplished through formal negotiations or official meetings. The community consultations took place in villages that could only be reached by helicopter or armored convoy, where traditional leaders and youth representatives gathered under trees or in schoolhouses to discuss how international assistance could be structured to serve local needs rather than external agendas. The conversations were conducted in Sango, French, and various local languages, requiring interpreters who understood not just vocabulary but cultural context that determined whether proposals would be accepted, modified, or rejected entirely. The process was slow, sometimes frustrating, but absolutely essential for developing programs that could survive beyond the departure of international personnel. The breakthrough came when elders from 3 different ethnic groups agreed to participate in a pilot program that would restore traditional markets while creating employment opportunities for young men who had been recruited by armed groups primarily because they had no economic alternatives. The project required negotiating with local commanders to secure safe passage for traders, working with international donors to provide startup capital for small businesses, and establishing security arrangements that could protect markets without creating new sources of conflict between competing groups. The market restoration program began modestly, with weekly gatherings that brought together traders from different communities to sell agricultural products, handicrafts, and other goods that had been produced despite years of conflict and economic disruption. The initial sessions were tense, with participants who remained suspicious of each other's motives and concerned about security risks that could make trade relationships dangerous rather than beneficial. But gradually, as transactions proceeded without incident and profits began to accumulate, the markets evolved into social spaces where relationships could be rebuilt across ethnic divisions that had seemed unbridgeable. The success of the pilot program led to requests for expansion into other regions where similar conditions prevailed. But scaling up required addressing challenges that hadn't been apparent during the initial phase. Transportation infrastructure had been destroyed by years of conflict, making it difficult for traders to move goods between markets. Banking systems had collapsed, creating reliance on cash transactions that were vulnerable to theft and extortion. Most fundamentally, the program's success had attracted attention from armed groups that wanted to tax or control trade relationships they hadn't initially considered worth their attention. Working with UN security personnel and regional peacekeeping forces, I helped develop protection mechanisms that could secure trade routes without militarizing economic relationships that were supposed to provide alternatives to conflict-based resource extraction. The solution involved training local security committees that could monitor trade routes while maintaining the civilian character that was essential for community acceptance. The committees included representatives from all ethnic groups,
ensuring that security arrangements wouldn't favor some traders over others or create new sources of inequality that could undermine the broader peace-building objectives. The program's expansion was documented by international development organizations, academic researchers, and media outlets that were searching for examples of successful intervention in contexts where most international efforts had failed to achieve lasting results. The coverage brought attention that was both helpful and problematic, providing credibility that attracted additional donor support, while creating expectations that might be impossible to fulfill if political conditions changed or if the success couldn't be sustained once international personnel departed. My father learned about the Central African work through a documentary that featured interviews with market traders who described how the program had affected their families and communities. The film included brief segments where I explained the economic theory behind the approach, but the most powerful material consisted of testimonials from people whose lives had been directly affected by the opportunity to resume commercial activities that had been suspended for years due to security concerns and ethnic hostilities. When he called after watching the documentary, his questions were different from our previous conversations about international policy. Instead of asking about bureaucratic processes or diplomatic procedures, he wanted to understand how markets actually functioned in post-conflict environments, how traders established trust relationships across ethnic boundaries, and how economic programs could address political problems that military interventions had failed to resolve. The specificity of his questions suggested that he was finally beginning to understand that my work involved practical problem solving rather than abstract policy formulation.
The work was demanding and often frustrating, but it provided the kind of purpose and professional satisfaction that made the personal sacrifices worthwhile. Marcus understood better than anyone the emotional costs of caring deeply about other people's suffering while maintaining the psychological distance necessary for effective intervention. The African assignment that would define the next phase of my career began with another early morning phone call, this time from the Secretary of State's office with a request that carried the weight of presidential attention. Ethnic violence in the Central African Republic had escalated beyond the capacity of regional peacekeeping forces to contain, and the international community was debating whether to authorize a full military intervention or attempt diplomatic solutions that had failed repeatedly over the previous decade. My experience with post-conflict economic development was considered essential for any approach that prioritized long-term stability over short-term crisis management. The flight to Bangui took me across time zones and cultural boundaries that separated comfortable diplomatic facilities from the reality of conflict zones where theoretical policies encountered human consequences that couldn't be abstracted or minimized. The capital city carried scars from years of violence, with buildings that showed bullet holes, streets that emptied after dark, and a population that had learned to navigate between competing armed groups whose control over territory shifted based on factors that outsiders struggled to understand or predict. The United Nations compound where I would be based for the next 8 months was surrounded by walls topped with razor wire, a physical barrier that symbolized the distance between international intervention and local communities whose cooperation would determine whether any peace-building effort could succeed. Inside the compound, representatives from dozens of countries worked on humanitarian assistance, security coordination, and political mediation that required understanding ethnic divisions, resource competition, and historical grievances that dated back to colonial boundaries drawn by Europeans who had never visited the territories they were dividing. My role involved working with community leaders from different ethnic groups to develop economic programs that could provide alternatives to the resource extraction and territorial control that had fueled decades of conflict. The approach required understanding how traditional governance systems had been disrupted by colonial administration, how post-independence politics had exacerbated ethnic tensions, and how international intervention had often inadvertently strengthened the very dynamics it was intended to address. The work demanded cultural sensitivity, technical expertise, and the kind of patient relationship building that couldn't be accomplished through formal negotiations or official meetings. The community consultations took place in villages that could only be reached by helicopter or armored convoy, where traditional leaders and youth representatives gathered under trees or in schoolhouses to discuss how international assistance could be structured to serve local needs rather than external agendas. The conversations were conducted in Sango, French, and various local languages, requiring interpreters who understood not just vocabulary, but cultural context that determined whether proposals would be accepted, modified, or rejected entirely. The process was slow, sometimes frustrating, but absolutely essential for developing programs that could survive beyond the departure of international personnel. The breakthrough came when elders from 3 different ethnic groups agreed to participate in a pilot program that would restore traditional markets while creating employment opportunities for young men who had been recruited by armed groups primarily because they had no economic alternatives. The project required negotiating with local commanders to secure safe passage for traders, working with international donors to provide startup capital for small businesses, and establishing security arrangements that could protect markets without creating new sources of conflict between competing groups. The market restoration program began modestly, with weekly gatherings that brought together traders from different communities to sell agricultural products, handicrafts, and other goods that had been produced despite years of conflict and economic disruption. The initial sessions were tense, with participants who remained suspicious of each other's motives and concerned about security risks that could make trade relationships dangerous rather than beneficial. But gradually, as transactions proceeded without incident and profits began to accumulate, the markets evolved into social spaces where relationships could be rebuilt across ethnic divisions that had seemed unbridgeable. The success of the pilot program led to requests for expansion into other regions where similar conditions prevailed, but scaling up required addressing challenges that hadn't been apparent during the initial phase. Transportation infrastructure had been destroyed by years of conflict, making it difficult for traders to move goods between markets. Banking systems had collapsed, creating reliance on cash transactions that were vulnerable to theft and extortion. Most fundamentally, the program's success had attracted attention from armed groups that wanted to tax or control trade relationships they hadn't initially considered worth their attention. Working with UN security personnel and regional peacekeeping forces, I helped develop protection mechanisms that could secure trade routes without militarizing economic relationships that were supposed to provide alternatives to conflict-based resource extraction. The solution involved training local security committees that could monitor trade routes while maintaining the civilian character that was essential for community acceptance. The committees included representatives from all ethnic groups, ensuring that security arrangements wouldn't favor some traders over others or create new sources of inequality that could undermine the broader peace-building objectives. The program's expansion was documented by international development organizations, academic researchers, and media outlets that were searching for examples of successful intervention in contexts where most international efforts had failed to achieve lasting results. My father learned about the Central African work through a documentary that featured interviews with market traders who described how the program had affected their families and communities. The film included brief segments where I explained the economic theory behind the approach, but the most powerful material consisted of testimonials from people whose lives had been directly affected by the opportunity to resume commercial activities that had been suspended for years due to security concerns and ethnic hostilities. When he called after watching the documentary, his questions were different from our previous conversations about international policy. Instead of asking about bureaucratic processes or diplomatic procedures, he wanted to understand how markets actually functioned in post-conflict environments, how traders established trust relationships across ethnic boundaries, and how economic programs could address political problems that military interventions had failed to resolve. The specifics of his questions suggested that he was finally beginning to understand that my work involved practical problem solving rather than abstract policy formulation.
His questions demonstrated serious engagement with technical details rather than polite curiosity. And our conversation lasted for over 2 hours as we discussed everything from donor coordination to community engagement strategies to the challenge of measuring success in contexts where progress was often incremental and difficult to quantify objectively. When the conversation ended, he said something that took me completely by surprise. "I'm proud of the work you've chosen to do," he said quietly. "I didn't understand it for a long time, but I've been learning about these problems, and I can see why people need the skills you've developed." The admission represented the recognition I had been seeking since childhood, acknowledgement that my career choices had value, according to criteria he could respect, even if they were different from the metrics he had traditionally used to evaluate professional success. The wedding ceremony took place on a clear October afternoon when the Virginia countryside displayed its autumn colors with the kind of natural beauty that provided perfect settings for promises made with the intention of lasting lifetimes. Marcus and I had written vows that acknowledged the unusual demands of our careers, while expressing commitment to supporting each other through challenges that neither of us could fully anticipate. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, focused on the substance of commitment rather than elaborate displays that might have seemed inappropriate given the nature of work that had brought us together. The reception featured toasts from colleagues who had worked with us in refugee camps, post-conflict zones, and diplomatic settings where personal relationships had been forged through shared professional challenges. Ambassador Chen spoke about the importance of maintaining perspective during difficult assignments, while Marcus's supervisor from the UNHCR described how humanitarian work required both technical competence and emotional resilience that few people could sustain over entire careers. The speeches painted a picture of lives dedicated to purposes larger than individual advancement, and I realized that we had built a community of people who understood what we were trying to accomplish, even when the broader society might not fully appreciate the significance of international humanitarian work. My father's toast was brief but meaningful, acknowledging that he had initially failed to understand the importance of work that couldn't be measured by traditional metrics of success. "They build bridges between people who have forgotten how to talk to each other," he said simply. "That might be more important than the buildings I've spent my life constructing." The admission represented a complete reversal of his earlier dismissive attitude, recognition that meaningful work could take forms that he had never considered but was finally able to appreciate. The moment crystallized something that had been developing gradually over the previous 2 years. The evolution of our relationship from disappointed expectations to mutual respect based on genuine understanding of each other's choices and accomplishments. His recognition didn't erase the years of feeling dismissed or misunderstood, but it provided a foundation for moving forward that was based on who we actually were, rather than who we had expected each other to become. When he asked whether he and my mother could visit me during my next assignment, I realized that our relationship had finally found solid ground that could support the kind of ongoing connection I had always hoped we might achieve. The summit invitation arrived with presidential letterhead, requesting my presence at the Global Economic Forum where world leaders would address trade wars threatening international stability. My reputation as a crisis negotiator had reached the highest levels of government. At the forum, tensions ran high between nations whose economic disputes had escalated beyond normal diplomatic channels. When the Chinese delegation threatened to withdraw from crucial supply chain agreements, I found myself mediating between superpowers whose decisions would affect billions of lives. The breakthrough came through understanding cultural contexts that other negotiators had overlooked. By framing economic cooperation as mutual prosperity rather than zero-sum competition, I helped craft agreements that satisfied national pride while addressing practical concerns. My father watched the summit coverage, seeing his daughter seated between foreign ministers and heads of state. When reporters mentioned my role in preventing a global recession, he finally understood what meaningful work looked like in the modern world.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.